The air in the Ituri Rainforest does not move the way air moves in a city. It sits on the skin, heavy as wet wool, thick with the exhale of 10,000 trees and the slow rot of fallen leaves. The light that manages to break through the triple canopy arrives in narrow green columns, pale shafts that catch the drifting pollen and the tiny black flies that never stop humming. The forest floor is a world of perpetual twilight, where mushrooms glow pale on dead wood, and the sounds of birds come from so high above they seem to arrive from another country entirely. 12 meters ahead, frozen mid-step with his left foot hovering just above a carpet of wet leaves, is a Mbuti man named Iwango. He is small, barely taller than the sapling at his shoulder, his chest wrapped in a strip of bark cloth, his feet bare and broad and silent. In his right hand is a small net made from twisted liana vine, the mesh fine enough to catch a butterfly. In his left is a short spear with a tip blackened in fire. He has been tracking an okapi since first light, reading the forest the way you might read a newspaper, and just now he has heard something that made every muscle in his body go still. The okapi is close, maybe 30 strides, just past the stand of mumbao trees where the sunlight pools on a fallen trunk. Iwango can smell it, a musk like wild ginger in damp earth. He can hear the tiny click of its hooves on a buried root. The okapi is what the outside world calls a ghost species, a creature scientists insisted was mythological until 1901, when a British explorer finally produced a skull. But Iwango's people have known the okapi for thousands of years. They have sung songs about it. They have carved its shape into wood. They have hunted it in this same forest since before the Sahara dried into sand. And as Iwango stands there, barely breathing, his DNA is humming with a stranger truth than the okapi itself. Inside the cells of his body, coiled inside every nucleus, is the genetic signature of a species that no scientist has ever seen a single bone from. Not a skull, not a tooth, not a finger bone in some cave floor. This species has no name. It appears in no fossil record. And yet it is undeniably there, woven into the genome of this quiet hunter, passed down through thousands of generations like a rumor that refuses to die. The okapi snorts. A twig snaps. Iwango moves, and the forest swallows him whole. But the story does not move with him. It stays, hovering in the green light, waiting for the machines and the scientists and the centrifuges that would eventually come looking for it. Here is what those machines would find. The Mbuti are not a large population, roughly 40,000 people living in scattered bands throughout the Ituri Rainforest of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Their villages are temporary things, leaf huts built in a circle, abandoned when the hunting thins or the fruit trees stop bearing. They are one of the oldest continuous populations on Earth, and they are, by every reliable measurement, among the shortest humans who have ever lived. Adult Mbuti men average between 135 and 155 centimeters tall. The women are shorter still. For comparison, the global average for human males is over 170 centimeters. The Mbuti do not see this as a deficiency. In the forest, smallness is an advantage. Small bodies radiate heat more efficiently in the humid core of the rainforest. They require fewer calories. They move through dense undergrowth with the ease of water finding the low ground. To the Mbuti, their stature is simply what a human body becomes when it has lived in the deep forest for tens of thousands of years. But the Mbuti are not alone in their smallness, and this is where the story begins to spiral outward in ways no one expected. To the west, across more than 1,000 kilometers of forest and swamp and low mountains, live the Baka. They number around 40,000 as well, spread through Cameroon, Gabon, and the Republic of Congo. They are short in the same way, with the same broad faces and heavy brows and the same intimate knowledge of the forest. To the southeast, in the highlands of Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda, are the Twa, numbering closer to 90,000, equally small, equally ancient. Together, these scattered groups, often lumped together under a single contested label, total somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 people, stretched in a thin ribbon along the equatorial forest belt of Central Africa. For centuries, outsiders looked at these people and saw a single race. Short of stature, hunter by trade, forest by birth. The assumption was that they were one people who had fragmented, or one ancient stock that had simply stayed behind while the rest of humanity marched forward into agriculture and civilization, and the tall, grain-fed life. It was a neat story. It was also wrong. The first cracks in the story came from language. Here is a strange fact that linguists noticed almost immediately. None of these forest peoples speak their own language. Or rather, none of them speak a language that belongs uniquely to them. The Mbuti speak Bila or Ndaka or Lesse, languages borrowed from the neighboring Bantu farming villages. The Baka speak a Ubangian language, borrowed from their farming neighbors. The Twa speak Bantu languages identical to the Hutu populations around them. The original languages, the ones these forest peoples would have spoken before the farmers arrived, are gone, completely extinct. No written record, no surviving fragments, just silence. Think about what that means. A people loses its entire linguistic heritage, every story, every name for every plant, every song that was sung for 10,000 years, and replaces it all with borrowed words from the people who moved in next door. This does not happen by accident. It happens through centuries of contact, intermarriage, trade, displacement, and often domination. It happens when one culture is so overwhelming that the smaller culture simply cannot hold its own words together. The Bantu expansion was one of the great population movements in human history, a wave of iron-working farmers who swept out of West Africa beginning roughly 4,000 years ago, spreading east and south across the continent. They cleared forests, planted crops, built villages, and absorbed or displaced the hunter-gatherers they encountered. By the time the dust settled, the forest peoples were speaking the farmers' words. But language is only words. What DNA would later reveal is that the story went far, far deeper than anyone imagined. In 2014, a team of researchers published a landmark study in the journal Nature Communications. The lead author was Etienne Patin, and the study set out to answer a question that had been simmering for decades. What actually is the genetic history of Africa's rainforest hunter-gatherers? How are these groups related to each other, and how are they related to the farming populations that now surround them? The team sequenced the full genomes of individuals from several forest groups, including the Mbuti of the eastern Congo basin and the Baka of the western forests. The results landed in the scientific community like a stone dropped into still water. The two short-statured forest groups, the Mbuti and the Baka, the ones that everyone assumed were branches of a single ancient people, turned out to have last shared a common ancestor somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 years ago. That is older than the earliest cities, older than the invention of writing, older than the end of the last ice age. These two groups were not cousins. They were more like strangers who happened to live in similar forests and had come to look similar through entirely separate journeys. Push the clock back further, and the story gets even stranger. The ancestors of all these forest-dwelling groups diverged from the ancestors of the Bantu-speaking farmers roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. That is before agriculture existed anywhere on the planet. Before the first dog was domesticated, before the last Neanderthals died out in Europe. At that moment, there were no farmers and no hunter-gatherers in the way we understand those labels. There were just humans, spread thin across a dangerous world, and one branch of humanity walked into the Central African forest and did not come out. But the real revelation, the one that forced every geneticist in the field to sit up and reconsider what they thought they knew, came when the researchers compared the short stature of the Western and Eastern groups. Here is the problem. Both the Baka in the West and the Mbuti in the East are short, very short by global standards. The obvious explanation is that they are short because they share an ancestry that was short, that some ancient common ancestor entered the forest small and stayed that way. This is intuitive. It is reasonable. It is also wrong. In 2014, bioanthropologist George Perry and his colleagues published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that examined the genetics of height in these populations. They looked for the specific genetic variants associated with short stature in the Western Baka and in the Eastern Mbuti, expecting to find the same variants in both groups. What they found instead was that the two groups had arrived at their small size through entirely different genetic pathways. The Western Baka carried variants in genes with names like DOC3 and CISH and IGHV353. These genes are involved in immune function and cellular structure, and they appear to have been shaped by natural selection in the rainforest environment. The Eastern Mbuti, by contrast, carried variants in an entirely different set of genes involved in the growth hormone signaling pathway, the biological machinery that regulates how tall a person grows. The result in both cases was a short adult body, but the mechanism was different. The genetic route was different. The evolutionary solution was independently invented. This is what biologists call convergent evolution. It is the same process that gave dolphins and sharks their similar streamlined shapes, despite one being a mammal and the other a fish. It is the same process that gave bats and birds their wings. In two separate forests, separated by vast distances and thousands of years of isolation, two separate human lineages faced the same environmental pressures, and each independently found its own genetic formula for surviving in the deep forest. Small body, efficient metabolism, a physiology tuned to the sweltering, food-scarce world beneath the canopy. The implications of this finding are enormous, and they ripple outward in every direction. The word that has historically been used to describe these people, the label under which they have been catalogued and studied and displayed in European human zoos and measured with calipers by colonial scientists, that label assumes a single people with a single origin. The genetics says otherwise. There is no single forest people. There are multiple forest peoples, each with its own deep history, each with its own path through the ancient dark. The label is a convenience, a shorthand that collapses a rich and complex human story into a single flat category. The DNA refuses to cooperate with the label. The DNA insists on being more interesting than that. And it gets even more interesting still. In 2014, the same Patin study delivered another finding, one that sits at the absolute frontier of what genetics can tell us about the deep human past. The researchers were examining the genomes of the Mbuti and noticed something unusual in the data. There were sections of DNA that did not match any modern human population. More than that, they did not match Neanderthal DNA, which had by that point been fully sequenced, and they did not match Denisovan DNA, the other archaic human species that geneticists had recently identified from a finger bone in a Siberian cave. These sections were something else entirely. They were older, more divergent, and they appeared in the Mbuti genome at a level of roughly 8 to 13%. Let me translate that into something you can hold on to. Roughly 1 in every 10 to 12 positions in a Mbuti person's genome appears to come from a human species that is not us, not Homo sapiens, not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, a fourth branch of the human family tree, one that separated from the lineage leading to modern humans more than 700,000 years ago. Longer ago than the Neanderthal split, longer ago than the Denisovan split. A lineage so ancient that when its ancestors walked the African continent, the Sahara was green grassland and the first stone hand axes were still a future technology. This species is known in the scientific literature as a ghost population, or the African ghost. There is no fossil, no skeleton has ever been found that can be attributed to it. No cave painting, no tool cache, no burial site. The only evidence that it ever existed is the DNA that persists inside the cells of living Mbuti people, and in smaller amounts inside the Baka and a few other Central African populations. It is a species reconstructed entirely from the genetic echo it left behind in the bodies of the people who carry it today. Think about the weight of that. There was an entire species of human beings, intelligent, tool-using, language-speaking perhaps, living somewhere in Central Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. And we know almost nothing about them. We do not know what they looked like. We do not know where they lived, except that it was somewhere in the African continent. We do not know how they died out, or whether they were absorbed gradually into the expanding waves of Homo sapiens moving through the same territory. All we know is that somewhere along the way, the ancestors of the Mbuti interbred with them, absorbed their genes, and carried those genes forward into the present. The Mbuti are walking archives. They are living repositories of a vanished branch of the human family, carrying in their DNA the only remaining trace of a people who left no bones, no artifacts, no monuments, nothing but the subtle signature written in the double helix. And here's the part that should send a chill through anyone who thinks they know the human story. This ghost population is not the only one. In recent years, geneticists have identified ghost populations lurking in the genomes of other African groups, including West African populations like the Yoruba. The African continent, it turns out, was not the simple stage on which one human species evolved and spread. It was a crowded place, a landscape of overlapping and interbreeding human lineages, species meeting and mixing and separating again over hundreds of thousands of years. The story of human origins is not a neat branching tree. It is a braided river, and the Mbuti carry some of the oldest water in it. The DNA of the Mbuti also tells a story about survival and about the brutal demands of life in the rainforest. Natural selection does not care about narrative. It cares about who stays alive long enough to reproduce. And in the equatorial forest, the threats are specific and relentless. Malaria is one of them. The rainforest belt of Central Africa is one of the most malaria-intense regions on Earth, a place where the parasite kills children before they learn to walk, and leaves the survivors with chronic illness that shapes entire economies. Human populations that have lived in malarial zones for long periods have evolved genetic defenses, the most famous being the sickle cell trait in West Africa. The Mbuti and their forest relatives carry their own unique adaptations. Studies have identified variants in the JIPA and JIP genes, the genes that code for the surface proteins on red blood cells that the malaria parasite uses to gain entry. The variants found in the forest populations appear to alter the structure of these proteins in a way that makes it harder for the parasite to invade. It is a subtle defense, the product of thousands of generations of selection pressure, and it is different from the defenses evolved by farming populations. The forest people did not borrow their malaria resistance from the farmers. They evolved their own. Then there is the immune system more broadly. The rainforest is a biological warfare zone, a hot, wet, teeming environment filled with pathogens that would kill an unadapted human within weeks. The forest populations have evolved unique HLA variants, the human leukocyte antigen system that forms the backbone of the adaptive immune response. These variants are not found at high frequency in any other human population on Earth. They represent a bespoke immune system, custom-built by evolution for the specific disease ecology of the Central African forest. When scientists first sequenced these HLA regions, they found diversity and novelty that no textbook had predicted. The Mbuti were fighting a biological war that no one had ever studied, and they were winning it with weapons that no other human population even carries. And underneath all of this, driving the short stature that outsiders have fixated on for centuries, are the genes that regulate growth hormone and thyroid function. The Mbuti body has been tuned by evolution to be efficient. In an environment where food is seasonally scarce and the forest yields its calories in small, hard-won increments, a small body is a fuel-efficient body. The thyroid is the metabolic thermostat, and the growth hormone pathway is the machinery that decides how much of the food energy gets converted into height and tissue. In the Mbuti, this machinery has been adjusted downward, set to a different default than in farming populations where grains and livestock provide surplus calories. The short stature is not a defect, it is a specialization. It is what a human body becomes when it has been shaped by the forest for thousands of generations. What the DNA studies have done, in aggregate, is force a complete rewriting of the history of Central Africa. The old story was simple. Hunter-gatherers lived in the forest, then farmers arrived, and the hunter-gatherers either assimilated or retreated deeper into the trees. The new story is much stranger and much older. The forest peoples are not the remnants of a single failed migration. They are the descendants of multiple ancient human lineages, some of which interbred with a ghost species that has no fossil record, some of which split from the ancestors of all farming peoples 60 to 70,000 years ago, some of which then evolved independently for tens of thousands of years in separate corners of the same vast rainforest, arriving at similar solutions through different genetic routes. They are not a footnote to the agricultural story. They are the pre-agricultural story, preserved in living tissue, walking and hunting and singing in the same forest where their ancestors have lived since before the last ice age. And when the farmers did arrive, the interaction was complex. The forest peoples adopted the farmers' languages, but not their genes at a large scale. The genetic mixing between forest groups and farming groups appears to have been one-directional in many cases, with farming genes flowing into forest populations more often than forest genes flowed out. The reasons are not fully understood, but the pattern suggests social dynamics in which forest people married into farming communities or were absorbed by them, gradually taking on the language and customs of the dominant group while retaining a core of their own genetic heritage. The result is the strange situation of today. Forest peoples speaking languages that are not their own, carrying genes that are not the farmers, preserving a deep ancestry that predates agriculture entirely. In 2018, another major study, published in Nature Ecology and Evolution and led by Marie Lopez, examined the demographic history of these populations in even finer detail. The team looked at the genetic load carried by African hunter-gatherers and farmers, the accumulation of slightly harmful mutations that build up in any population over time. They found that the hunter-gatherer populations had small effective population sizes for long periods, meaning that genetic drift played a large role in their evolution. and that certain mutations that would have been weeded out in larger populations were able to persist. This is consistent with the idea of small, isolated bands living in the forest for tens of thousands of years, never numbering more than a few thousand breeding individuals, yet somehow enduring, generation after generation, in one of the most demanding environments on Earth. The picture that emerges from all of this is not one that fits neatly into a YouTube thumbnail. It is not a simple revelation that upends everything in a single sentence. It is a slow, cumulative rewriting, layer by layer, of what we thought we knew about a part of the human story that has been ignored for too long. The Mbuti and their forest relatives were treated for centuries as a curiosity, an anthropological footnote, a primitive remnant from some earlier stage of human evolution. The DNA now shows that they are nothing of the kind. They are the carriers of the deepest living human lineages on the continent. They are the keepers of genetic diversity that exists nowhere else on Earth. They are the last physical evidence of a human species that is otherwise entirely lost to time. There is a reason this matters, and it is not only academic. The forest peoples of Central Africa are endangered. Their forests are being logged, their territories are being carved up for agriculture and mining. Their populations are small and shrinking, and with each generation, some of the genetic diversity they carry is lost forever. The ghost species that lives inside the Mbuti genome is not going to be around forever. The convergence of small stature adaptations is not going to be around forever. The unique immune variants and malaria defenses, and the deep ancestry that predates agriculture, all of it is fragile. All of it is carried in the bodies of a few 100,000 people living at the margins of the modern world. When the DNA of the last Mbuti person is gone, the last trace of that ghost species is gone with it. Not just the bones, which were never found, but the very possibility of ever knowing that species existed. The only record will be the data files stored in a laboratory somewhere, the genetic sequences saved on a hard drive, and eventually those will be forgotten too. The forest swallows everything. It swallowed the okapi for centuries until outsiders finally believed it was real. It swallowed the ghost species entirely. It will swallow the Mbuti too, if the world does not pay attention. Let me take you back to the forest now. Back to the clearing where Iwango stood, listening to the okapi breathing in the green dark. The forest at dusk is a concert of insects, a rising swell of buzzing and clicking that fills the air like a physical pressure. The canopy darkens from green to black, and the narrow shafts of light dim into nothing. The leaf huts of the Mbuti camp glow faintly with cook fires, and the smell of smoked meat and wild roots drifts on the still air. Children run between the huts, their bare feet silent on the packed earth, and the women sit in a circle, grinding leaves and talking in low voices. The language they speak is not their own. It is the language of the farmers who live on the forest edge, the language of people who cut the trees and plant gardens and measure their lives in harvests. But the songs they sing, the old songs, the ones passed down from before the language changed, those are their own. And the DNA inside every one of them, from the oldest grandmother to the infant at her breast, carries the ghost species and the convergent adaptations and the 50,000-year-old echo of a split from the ancestors of everyone who ever built a city. That story is still there, waiting to be found. But now, for the first time, science has spoken. If you want to see the next reveal, subscribe. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Thanks for staying until the very end. Goodbye for now.